I have ADHD, so that is the first thing you need to know about me. And the second thing is that I am now able to use my lifelong motor mouth for good instead of evil. And I use it to speak about making ADHD human for organizations to see their employees as human, and also just for individuals to feel seen and heard and respected by their friends, family, and offices. My story is it's not really a shocking story. There's not going to be any attempt at suicide or any of those things that are actually about 5 times more common for folks with ADHD than they are in the general population. But I think it's important to tell these sort of smaller stories because it helps people get an understanding of what ADHD truly is and what it isn't. When I started to suspect I might have ADHD and I told people about it, I heard things like, I think everybody has a little ADHD, and aren't attention spans pretty short these days, with social media and the pandemic, and so people are looking at TikTok and no one can really focus themselves. These kinds of things, although they're not meant with any malice, they show a lot of judgment. They expose the stigma around this condition, and they sort of treat it as though ADHD is something to be solved and fixed. A lot of folks look at, yes, not having a very long attention span, multitasking, sort of being unfocused. But there's a view that oftentimes people think this is a young boy who's disruptive in class and doesn't know how to behave and eventually needs to be medicated to fix his behavior and probably turns into a bit of a zombie when that happens. And the way that we talk about ADHD in both the medical community, the media, and everywhere else doesn't really help dispel this myth. I pulled this definition of ADHD off of WebMD. So ADHD is a brain disorder in which you have trouble paying attention. You might also tend to act on impulse or have too much energy. So when I look at the words of this definition now as someone who understands a bit more about what the condition is, we've got the word disorder, and sometimes it's neurological condition or neurodevelopmental condition or disability. That sounds very serious. We've got a medical condition to deal with. And then we move into talking about trouble paying attention, impulse, and energy, which tend to be just sort of inconveniences in many people's mind. And so it's a little bit interesting that we talk about having a condition and then we just sort of talk about the inconveniences. And later on that page, they pull up a laundry list of issues that you may have around concentration and remembering information and mood swings and, motivation or boredom. And aside from anxiety and depression, and all of these, by the way, are things that I personally identify with, there's a much longer list on WebMD, but these are all things that most of us can identify with some of the time, and we all feel we have issues with on occasion. And so it's pretty important to realize that the way that the medical community describes this condition doesn't necessarily get to the magnitude of what it can be. They neglect to mention also that the condition, in order to be diagnosed, also has to be something that you are impaired by in at least 2 major areas of your life. So you've got to either in your life, your social relationships and friends and family be impacted in the way you interact, or caring for yourself even, or at school or work, you need to have had some impact. So at school, that might look as like poor grades. In work, it might be being disorganized or having poor time management. It can be any and all of these things, and everybody experiences these symptoms differently. The second thing that must be true is that when you're diagnosed as a child, it's not such an issue because you are young, but when you have been overlooked and you are diagnosed as an adult, it's necessary that you've been impaired by these things significantly since you were young. So since before I think they've upgraded it to 12 years old now, you have to be at least have been seeing these impacts below the age of 12 in order to receive a diagnosis. So those two things together kind of share a little bit more of the gravity of the condition. Folks with ADHD have interest-based nervous systems. So what that means is where folks without ADHD are typically able to motivate themselves to do a task when it is important or when there's some potential reward or some consequence to not doing it, folks with ADHD do not get motivated by that at all. So the acronym INCUP that I put up on here is really just a whole bunch of different ways, in my opinion, to say we need to be interested in the task in order to motivate ourselves to get started on it. And so the I is for interest. It's not for importance at all. N is for novelty, which can be interesting. C is for complexity, which can spur interest. Urgency is my absolute number one thing that gets me moving on anything. If I'm preparing for this talk, I start writing it in earnest a day or two before at most, probably. And the P is for passion. And so those things, one of those things or a combination of those things need to be true in order for me to force myself to get a task done, even if it's important. Essentially, there are two parts of your brain, one that helps you to understand what you need to do, and one that tells you, okay, now go and act on that thing. And folks with ADHD have a weaker connection between those two. So that means that our executive functions, like self-awareness, knowing what to put our attention on and keeping our attention and that we've been distracted, inhibition and our ability to control it, our working memory, the ability to hold images in our minds or know what our verbal internal monologue is saying, emotional self-regulation. I'm already finding myself getting a little bit emotional sometimes in this talk as well. So I'm going to have my tissue here, don't worry. Self-motivation. So again, just trying to get yourself going, and then planning. How do I get organized? How do I take ideas and pick them apart and put them back together to solve problems? So those are the things that we truly have challenges with. And those are the executive functions. I was able to try a supervised trial of medication. My doctor wanted me to see what it was like not to be distracted. And so after I finished arguing with him that I wasn't distracted at all and that I didn't need medication because I'd been successful all my life, I agreed that the short-term trial was something to try. So the first day, all these stories come from the very first day, I took my medication and I walked out into my kitchen to make my coffee about a half hour later. When I got to the coffee machine, I looked to the side and saw, oh, the dishwasher is ajar. And I opened it. It was full. The tab was in. It was fully stacked and ready to go. I'd just forgotten to put it on the night before. Now, what would normally happen every other normal day is that I would say, oh, dishwasher, look, I've got this coffee cup. It's just about to be dirty. Why don't I wait till I'm done my coffee? And then I will put it in the dishwasher and turn it on. And then I would go to my desk and I would start reading the news, and then I'd go back and get coffee and say, oh yeah, dishwasher. And then I'd go back to my desk and I'd do a bit of work and I'd go back, get coffee and say, oh yeah, dishwasher. And then I would go have a shower and I'd come back and sit down. And around 2 p.m, when I really get going in my work, I would turn my back on the kitchen, never think of it again until dinner time, and then realize I had no clean dishes to cook with. I had no motivation to wash dishes by hand, and I would order out for dinner, get takeout. So that, aside from being incredibly irritating, and most people would say not fairly normal for folks to forget that many times, it also cost me money. It also meant I haven't eaten as well at certain points. This particular day, I took my medication, and instead of going through that process I've just described, I thought, maybe I should wait until this coffee cup is dirty and then turn on the dishwasher. And then I said, no, I'll just put it on now, closed the door and started it. And then I stopped in my tracks because I thought, what on earth? Are you telling me that people just decide to do something? They know they should do it and they just act. That was mind-blowing to me because it had never happened to me before. Similarly, my work example. Part of this experiment was to find out whether or not I could be more focused. So I went to my desk and I started working on a piece of paper, a contract or something. And I pushed through to not look at the messages that tended to pop up on my computer every day. And I did that for a while. And then I thought, well, what would happen if I did actually check this message? Would I be able to return to my work, or would I find, as usual, that I looked at everything else under the sun? I got distracted by social media. I remembered I had to book a doctor's appointment. I checked my emails, whatever it was. So I went over to look at the message. I corresponded a tiny bit with a friend of mine. And then I realized that I should get back to work. I turned back to the paperwork that I was working on. I remembered what I was doing. I remembered where I was in the process, and I continued working as if nothing had happened. Again, an absolute revelation. Again, these are just the domestic ways and the sort of those life ways where ADHD can impact our ability to act. Now, I want to take it over to work for a second, because 3 in 5 people report having either lost a job or left a job as a result of their ADHD symptoms. And so I wanted to share a pretty long bit of feedback that I've received from managers during a 360 review that encapsulate a lot of the things that I heard at work. And just share what those things were. So first of all, he said, if Sarah's greatest strengths are her energy and intelligence, her greatest weaknesses are her ambition and self-confidence. As I get emotional here. Normally positive, has a tendency to slip into entitlement, which leaves the impression it's all about Sarah. And then maybe she should develop a long view of her career, think about what other leaders are modeling, how they interact with others, their flexibility, openness to others' ideas, and when they arrive in the office. So the first half of this is really saying, here are the things that you're doing wrong. So you've got great energy and intelligence, but you're too ambitious and you're all about yourself. And yet, if I think about what the symptoms of ADHD are, and we've talked about some of them, my energy is a result of my hyperactivity, which is often in my head, not so much coming out in public, but it is also visible in that way. The intelligence comes from the curiosity that I have, the constant looking at different ways to do things, and the boredom and impulsiveness that I have. Same with ambition and confidence. If I'm bored and I don't want to sit and do the same thing for years on end, I'm pushing myself to try and move forward to something new and exciting. And all about Sarah, I've since learned, is to do with the fact that a lot of folks with ADHD actually show their empathy by finding ways in common to connect with someone. And so I would show my empathy by, you tell me you've had a bad day, and I say, oh, I also had a bad day. Here are all the ways my day was bad. And some people would see that as it being me not listening and turning it all about me, when in fact, I'm just trying to lay out some options for you to find that commonality and for us to connect. And then we get down to the solutions that are offered. And they boil down, in my opinion, to a few things. So first off, they boil down to see what others are doing, act like us, fit in, be the same, right? Then they asked me to be flexible. They asked me to be more patient. They asked me to be timely and come to work earlier, because I was never early or half the time on time for anything, because time management, I just have no relationship with time. So, we've looked at this feedback, and essentially it is, here is a personality I don't get along with and I'm offended by. And here, the way to fix that is to fit in with us and our kind and our culture, which is very difficult when I have very little ability to do some of those solution type suggestions because of my executive functioning challenges and my need to be interested. Now, this is where my mental health journey really kind of begins. And we've talked about the fact that emotional regulation is a challenge. So I apologize if I start weeping a little bit. Some of these slides are a little bit overwhelming for me. So I did leave that job where the feedback that I just described was given to me after many, many years. There were urgent fires to put out. There were many groups that had to coordinate all their activities together. There were meetings to attend. And then there was also the social element. We had to, go for lunches and dinners to do the networking thing. And on top of that, I'm an extrovert. So I really invest in my friendships. I spent time after work meeting friends and spending time with them. And then I also was heavily involved in competitive sport at a very high level. So I was training and playing sport very often. I was barely sleeping. And yet, with all that urgency on me all the time, I was thriving. Many friends suggested the idea of starting my own practice and just, do things my way, practice law for smaller entrepreneurial clients. And I threw myself into this entirely. ADHD folks are often very all or nothing about just about everything, which I just thought was my personality before. And so I built this legal business where I was able to choose my own clients, and I was able to choose my own hours and decide what was a reasonable timeline and all of those things. But what I quickly realized is that I was doing all of that, but I was not having the support that I had in a big organization. So I didn't have an assistant to keep me on track and make sure my calendar was up to date or book appointments for me or help me draft documents, which was way too boring for me. I didn't have any urgency because I was setting deadlines that could have been out in the future. And I didn't know at this time that was going to impact me because I didn't know I had this condition. And so very quickly, I started to feel a little bit down. I started to feel like I was failing and I wasn't getting everything done that I was supposed to get done. And I was having a hard time even doing the research about how does someone change a career? I didn't want to do the exercises that the business coaches I hired would give me, do the wheel of life and set your values out and those kinds of things. And so I started to observe over about an 8-year period that I was experiencing lots of these symptoms. Again, I was feeling down. I wouldn't have said I thought it was depression. I thought it was maybe just anxiety, but I was losing interest in things that I was doing. I was having a hard time going outside every day or having a shower every day. There was no reason to. I wasn't meeting anybody. I was finding myself bolting out of a dead sleep, panicking about I'd forgotten to do one thing or another the day before that I was supposed to do. My migraines kicked up. I've had those since aside from the anxiety and depression, I've had all of this since childhood, but migraines that were twice a week. They lasted 3 days. I had a day of reprieve in between. And I kept going to my doctor and saying, I'm having these migraines. I'm having physical pain, which my physio said, it's out of all proportion to what's physically wrong with you. I believe you that you're in pain, but I can't figure out why. And no one really pieced together that all 5 of these symptoms are symptoms of ADHD, because they were asked in separate meetings with my doctors or to different doctors. And I was sent to neurologists, ear, nose, and throat for my sinuses. I got MRIs and other scans to see if I had cancer, if I had something on my spine, to figure out what was going on. I was in tears, I was in pain, and I wasn't moving anywhere forward. So around this time last year, I was at a cocktail party and I was describing that I was digging back into my legal business. I was going to build it. I was going to hire these people and build it this way so it would suit my strengths. And then I got overwhelmed. I was describing this to someone in the party. And then I said, but then I thought, okay, I'll do it this way instead. And by the time I got to the 3rd version of what I was planning, she interrupted me and said, Sarah, do you have an ADHD diagnosis? And that was the first hint I had that anything was afoot. So I went to my doctor after a couple of months of hemming and hawing and talking to my friends about whether this could possibly be true. And I said, is it weird to get assessed just on the basis of a cocktail party comment? And my doctor kindly sent me and referred me. And within months, I was very lucky. I managed to have a diagnosis of ADHD. Both receiving the diagnosis and also being given the opportunity to try medication and see what the difference was absolutely life-changing. This is a slide I can't not cry on because it's very overwhelming. Oh, I can't click it. So I was finally able, with the diagnosis and with some information about ADHD, to see what the root cause of all these things were. I was overwhelmed. I was disorganized. I was forgetful, feeling like a failure, not having any motivation, paralyzed by making choices, exhausted all the time, feeling guilt and shame, and I couldn't stop procrastinating. I couldn't relax. And all of these things weren't because I was a bad person. They were because I had a condition. And I was able at that point to get this hope that this was something that could be dealt with. It could be something that could be understood. It could be handled and dealt with. And I didn't have to just live this way. I didn't have to be in pain. I didn't have to be nervous all the time. So I want to take this little second to just talk about the medication element of it, because while we're talking about words and stigma, we don't typically find ourselves finding it odd that someone took a Tylenol for a headache or got chemotherapy for cancer. And yet, for some reason, when it comes to ADHD, we talk about stimulants as turning children into zombies. We talk about it as giving children cocaine for breakfast. And of course, that's helpful. And we glorified it as a bit of a party drug, really. And I'll tell you that for me, stimulant medication does not make me high in any way. It calms the 7,000 thoughts in my head down to 2 or 3 that I can focus on at a time. And it allows me to not have the noise of everything else that's going on and distracting me from the work that I need to do. And so I think it's just really important to change as well the way that we think about medication. It's not the solution for everyone, and it's not often the full solution for anyone. There's still lots of lifestyle changes. There's a lot of societal changes that could take place, and I wouldn't, for example, have to fit into the 9 to 5. I could instead fit into the 2 to 10, which would be much more convenient for my working style. And so I think it's just so important to not start from a place that the society and that the media and that movies are telling us exist. We don't really know what anybody else is going through. This is true for all mental health issues. I didn't even know what I was going through. But we don't know if someone's having one bad day. We don't know if they're having a lifetime of mental health challenges or just a few months. On the outside, I come off as having it all together, except when I burst into tears randomly on video cassette. But, successful. I was a lawyer. I was doing a great job as a lawyer. I was keeping it all together and getting everything done. And yet, here I was, even unknown to myself, struggling. And so the words that were used to describe me in performance reviews or by friends, family, colleagues, all with the best of intentions, had that sort of cumulative effect of making me feel, unbeknownst to me, that maybe I wasn't so worthy. So curiosity and empathy are a great way to help beat that stigma of ADHD. And I'll ask you maybe to do three things when you think about this. So first of all, ask people what their experience is before judging what ADHD is, because it is so different for everybody else. Where I have no relationship with time, lots of people might not struggle as much with that, and they struggle instead with motivation or attention. Then listen to the answer. So rather than trying to solve that problem, just listen to what they have to say. And please, third and foremost, believe them, because there's nothing more invalidating than saying you're experiencing something and having someone say, oh, just try it this way instead. And I'm sure we've all heard that in the context of depression, for example. Just look on the bright side is not an effective comment to someone who's really, truly suffering from depression. And just in the same way that when I say I cannot go to the gym unless I have a competition coming up or there's a friend waiting there for me, telling me just get up at 6 a.m. and force yourself every day is just not a physical possibility for me. So believe me. Because we don't know so much or we don't hear enough, because people think of this as a made up excuse to be lazy, right? When you hear it in the news and you talk to others. So what I found is that nobody, when I was just speculating I had ADHD, people listened and nodded. But when I told them, oh, I got that diagnosis I was looking for, they said, oh yeah, I have ADHD too. They didn't admit it beforehand. There's a club, right? Because they don't want to be seen as lazy. They don't admit it at work. And that's kind of why I'm doing the work I'm doing. But there are so many presentations. There's the hyperactive, there's the inattentive. So women tend to be inattentive more. They're the daydreamers looking out the window, where the boys may be presenting as running around. It sounds like in your situation, it might even be the opposite. I am both. I have both the hyperactivity. I have 15 of 18 symptoms, which means if I only need 6 and there's 9 on each side, I have enough to satisfy both. And so I have them both. And for me, the hyperactivity used to be singing and making up songs at bedtime or not being quiet ever. But now it's in my head. It's playing games in my head. It's, conversing with myself when I'm bored in a conversation. And if you don't know what you're looking for, that this is a possibility for you, as your kids may not have, you don't always know where to go for the help that you need. So about 74% of cases of ADHD are hereditary. So in women, that's closer to 90%. So a lot of adults will discover that they have ADHD because their children are diagnosed first off, right? And they sort of see the commonality as they're talking to the doctors. So that is, I think, medically the cause. Now, I'm not really sure. There's a whole bunch of questions, is it exposure to, I don't know, different chemicals when you're young or in the womb? Can it be a cause? I think it can be if you've had a traumatic brain injury or something like that too. But that's where, it really, the clinical diagnosis assesses all of that to figure out whether it's truly ADHD or something else. So primarily it is hereditary.
I just wondered, as an adult, were you offended at all when the person said to you, had you ever been diagnosed with it?
Every time I tell that story, I expect everyone to say, oh my God, who is that horrible human that in the middle of a party had the gall to say that to you? The good news is, folks, like when I tell you I had a wonderful childhood, my parents told me I could be anything. They supported me with all the love in the world when they weren't telling me to be quiet. And so I have a very outsized self-confidence, and I do not offend easily. And even when I do offend, it's usually pretty brief, and as long as I talk it out with someone, I'm okay. But in this case, I actually kind of knew the woman, and I knew that she had told me before that someone in her family had some experience with it. So I just took it with a grain of salt, got curious myself. But yeah, I mean, that's everybody's question. And no, I was okay. I was more offended, to be honest, by the folks that, knowing nothing about me, thought that this was a horrible diagnosis to be solved, or that I, had to manage it in some special way when I'd been so successful all my life, so yeah, I try to take it with a grain of salt. People don't mean to be rude, even though it comes off that way, but that's exactly what we're talking about, the stigma and the words that we choose, right? Well, I mean, I'm a very outspoken person too, and I am pretty literal, and I often just say what I mean. And so it depends on the level of comfort and safety that I have with the person. But if I felt they wouldn't be offended, I probably would tiptoe and weigh into that in the same way, which is probably why I wasn't offended by this woman. I think it's just, and she asked it in a nice way. You know, have you thought about this possibility where saying something else like, oh gosh, you have this horrible diagnosis, or, you know, it looks like you have a major problem. What can I do? But the other thing you can do is you can actually just, if you're not comfortable and you don't have that relationship, is you can start to research it, right? You can look into, and I wish there were more books and articles that gave a more realistic picture of this, which is why I'm on this mission to talk about it so much. Because, you know, when you look it up, oh, it's something that makes you not have a good attention span, right? And that's not really very helpful to say, I feel like you don't pay attention to me and I don't know why, you know? So carefully is the answer in way less words. When your life is going well, you can mask and you can handle a lot of these things, right? But then at some point, life changes. For me, it meant a huge job and life change. For others, it might be having a baby and having to now handle the entire household on their own. You know, it can be exacerbated by things happening to people as well. But even more than asking what's happened to them, because not everybody wants to disclose, not everybody wants to share their trauma publicly. It's really asking, how can I support you, right? So if I have a time management thing, don't tell me you've got to work on your time management. Say, how can I help us get that thing done on time next time? And then I have to reflect and tell you how you can support me as well. And I'm not under any obligation to disclose my personal circumstances either, especially when it's somewhere at work. And just to your point about trying harder, like, you don't ask a paraplegic to try harder to walk, and you shouldn't be asking people with a different brain from you to do things the way that you do them with your brain. So, I mean, it is tough to find the right sources. What I think is really important in just about any kind of diversity and inclusion space is to find resources that are written by and consulted on by people that experience the condition. So there's a woman, for example, that I met who is an introvert, and she's a trauma therapist, and now she is a neuro-inclusive consultant for businesses. There's a very young woman, 20-something, former model, who is in the UK writing books every 5 minutes about, you know, one of them is called ADHD A to Z. And it's written for people with ADHD primarily, and it goes and has a couple pages, like little bite-sized things that someone with ADHD can focus and pay attention on, and talks about the different elements of it. She also does ADHD coaching, and so that's another opportunity if you've got a diagnosis and you want to talk to someone who kind of gets it. And oftentimes those coaches are also they also have ADHD, and so they've got those insights. And just find someone that sort of you jive with, I guess, personality wise. But yeah, I would say, you know, look for books that are written by people who have ADHD, and read. There's actually a really great website too. I'll try to put it in the chat here with my other contact info, but it's called Attitude Magazine. So it's ADD Etude. And it talks about ADHD and ADD as it was formerly called, and all kinds of those things, and little small articles that you can read, and you can search it for the specific issue that you want to address.
Hi, Sarah. I'm a retired educator.
Great.
And we are trained to pick up on these cues. And so I'm amazed that you could go through your entire educational career without having one of your teachers raise this as a possibility. It would be very interesting for you to go back and look at your old report cards.
I've done it, Paul.
Comments. Yeah.
I sure have. I took pictures of them all a few weeks ago at my mom's house. So I'll share with you. So my psychiatrist was very clear that folks with ADHD are not meeting their full potential. And I said to him in an info session, well, I mean, I got great grades. I used to come home, my parents were like, what happened to the other 2%, right? Like, I got 90 all the time. And so he essentially said, either my diagnosis is wrong and you don't actually have ADHD, or you're still not meeting your full potential. Like, you know, you should be getting 110% on everything. And that's kind of where you are. And it can also be potential in different places, right? So as I said, I don't know if they train this element of it, but there's a lot of information coming out now about how women are overlooked specifically because they present so differently. So they're not hyperactive and disruptive. They're societally trained to speak when spoken to and behave themselves and not take up too much space. And so instead, when they get distracted or, they're not attending to whatever lesson, they stare out the window at the butterflies and then they still fail the test or they don't finish the test on time or whatever it is, right? So, I mean, I was a very well-behaved child, trust me. It wasn't until OIC when I started skipping calculus that I ever had a bad grade in high school. But it was more in the relationships. Like I didn't get along with everybody. I was bullied at school. People didn't always like that I had a strong opinion and spoke out and all those kinds of things. So there were elements of it that were very obvious. And when I asked my mother, "Are you surprised by this?" She said, "Absolutely not. You couldn't pay attention to a thing." I thought, "Oh, weird. I didn't know that." And that's when I started to remember, oh yeah, stop fidgeting. Oh yeah, sit still. Oh yeah, singing all into the night, right? And so, yeah, I'm surprised too. I was a little, there's a bit of a mourning process, to be honest, when you get diagnosed quite this late, because you think, what could have been possible? Like, what would have happened in that 8 years of me sitting on my couch barely showering if I had known this was the thing and I could have addressed it in year 2 or 3 or 4, right? How much money would I have earned in the last 8 years? Where would my business be at this point? How many people could I have helped if I had known that stuff? So I am also a bit surprised, but I really don't think it's uncommon that it gets missed with women in particular.
Yeah, I would agree. Most of the diagnoses that were happening were the boys who were hyperactive.
Yeah. Well, thank you for the question and the perspective as well.
Thank you so much for your vulnerability and for sharing your journey. It was incredibly inspiring, and I know that it resonated with so many different people, and it really did make sense for a lot of things, including myself, now that I'm looking at myself through a different lens as well. I just want to thank you because I know, like you said, even the tears and different things, but I think your authenticity and your genuine nature just comes through. So thank you again for being here today.